Okay, ladies and gentlemen, let us start. I'm delighted to welcome you to this session, Selling of Heavy Topics. Hello, are we ready to start? Thank you. I'm very happy to welcome you to this session, Selling of Heavy Topics 2.0. 2.0, why? This is the second edition, actually. Last year on EuropeCom, here we had similar session, and it was so successful that the organizers decided to do it once again. And I see the room is full. It seems that this is still current, the interest. It is very nice that you are so many here, but on the other side, I'm a little bit worrying if we all European communicators think that our job is quite heavy and that we have to sell heavy topics. Do you consider yourself as seller of heavy topics? Just right, okay. Good, I have to tell you, I also consider myself a kind of, because I work in the European Parliament. My name is Svetla Tanova, I will be the moderator. And we try in the European Parliamentary Research Service to communicate about science and new technologies, and this is not easy always. But I have to tell you, when I look what our speakers today have on their plate, and what they have as a tasks to communicate, I think we're actually quite fine. I have to make some announcements. So it is web streamed, the session, and please Twitter. Okay, we will have also translation in French. This year, on this session, we will really focus on controversial topics. Topics which sometimes divide societies, with a lot of debates, with a lot of emotions, where sometimes is not so much place for facts and evidence. And we hardly can imagine more controversial topics, more challenging than Brexit. I'm going already to our first speaker, Stéphane de Ring. He is advisor of Michel Barnier. As we all know, he is the chief negotiator for Brexit. And Stéphane is dealing with public engagement, and he will give us some insights how they structured the communications around Brexit, which is, we are really very curious to know. I will ask you to keep your questions for after. I will give the floor to the three presentations, to the three speakers, and after this I will collect some questions and answers. Thank you. Stéphane, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Svetla. And good morning. Thank you, Svetla. And good morning, everyone. So Brexit, vaccines, and black hole is the panel. Quite an interesting combination. And to pick up on your introductory point on selling heavy topics and controversy, as the flyer of the workshop says, I would not argue that we on the EU27 side have ever felt that we have to sell a heavy topic, and neither that we would have to engage in controversy. Clearly that is rather different on the UK side, where Brexit and quite a bit of challenge for one and the other sides of the Brexit arguments. From our side, we have always said, well, this is what the British government decided. This is based on the referendum result. We regret it. We're losing one of the 28 members. To sell, obviously, since it's a winning proposition on our side. And staying away from controversy has certainly one of the important ingredients on the side of the EU, as much as possible, in terms of the communication side of Brexit, as well as in terms of the negotiation side. That is not to say that Brexit as such is not a heavy topic. It's just not a topic that we have really worries came out, that some political players in the 27 member states would try to capitalize on the British vote to sell their own project of Euroscepticism or anti-European political platforms. But I think looking back at that episode 3 years later, we are in a somewhat different era, even though populism obviously is a strong phenomenon in various European countries. Now let me be very brief by way of introduction on the communication side of Brexit and make just 4 points. The first point would be a point of political unity, and I think it's an important point for communicating European topics and European subjects to realize that on the EU27 side, in the Brexit story, that we had a remarkable unity of the 27. It's a peculiar feature of the EU in a way, because if you look at the last 10 years in terms of the migration debate or the debate on refugees, if you look at issues related to rule of law, you look at the way the Eurozone crisis occurred and how it also was managed politically, obviously unity was often an elusive concept, to say the least, in those issues. And in the Brexit context, it's different. And it is an important point to make, not just politically, but also from the communication side, because then what you do not get, what we have not got the last 3 years on the EU side, is internal blame or internal accusations between the 27. I think in terms of selling heavy topics, that is a normal phenomenon to have this kind of political controversy and debate between EU actors, political groups, member states, political players, business associations, NGOs, and all the rest of it. In the Brexit, that was very, very different, because there was a unity of purpose from the 27, based on a very strong and clear mandate from the 27 to the negotiation team. Now, we obviously worked on that politically, and that's one story, but also communication-wise. Clearly, if you look back at the last 3 years, there were key moments of communication which were Theresa May's speeches or government white papers that came out, where the 27 and ourselves coordinated, perhaps too strong a word, but at least shared lines to take, shared our reactions internally, so that it also from the communication side, that political unity would clearly show. And you could find many examples of that in the history, the recent history of the Brexit negotiations. So that's the first point, the unity point, the political unity point, which makes the communicating Brexit side on the 27 very peculiar in my view compared to other topics. Adopted an unprecedented first ever in a way, that we, for instance, when the negotiation mandate was published, that had never happened before. So in April, May 17, before we started negotiations, that was the time of the elections on the UK side, we started negotiations in June 17. The Commission published its draft negotiation directives, so the draft mandate for the Council to adopt. The Council then published its adopted mandate, negotiation directives, and the negotiation team, Michel Barnier, published position papers on the budget settlement, on the citizens' issues, on a number of other issues, published them in draft form as sent to the 27, and then in the final EU position paper form as sent to the UK. That obviously has also helped the unity, that transparency. I think that's on the EU27 side. We engaged in public events. Michel Barnier engaged in very intensive outreach, also not just in Brussels, but in the capitals as well, where he especially also went to national parliaments and often had televised and public debates in national parliaments with national MPs on the state of play of Brexit, or before the state of play had started, so to say, on how we were preparing for the negotiations. So unity, transparency, two key principles. Thirdly, the repetition of core messages. I think so often in communication, I think people are seduced by the need to do something new rather than just repeat what had been said already. And I think if you look at the first 9 months, we said not much more, June 16 to March 17, than 4 words: no negotiation without notification. So please notify UK that you're leaving the EU, and then we can start discussing. So no negotiation without notification was repeated week after week on the EU27 side. The issue of, there are priority issues, so there's a sequencing to the negotiations, citizens, budget, Ireland first, and then we can move to the discussion on the future relationship, was repeated ad nauseam by the EU27. And was, of course, underscored again by a strong mandate from the European Council to the negotiation team. So again, the backdrop of the unity was, of course, very, very important in that. And then when we started the discussion on the future relationship, and this is where I wanted to show a slide to you, we hammered home the point of the single market integrity and what we would then, in jargon, would call the balance of rights and obligations. It was a very abstract concept that we kept coming back to. The UK and its future relationship with the EU, once it will have left, we will need to have a proper balance of rights and obligations in terms of the rights that the EU and the UK undertake towards each other and on the obligations that go along with that. The obligations are, in other words, kind of the constraints on the autonomy of both parties. And of course, Brexit is a project of regaining autonomy on the UK side. So the issue of rights and obligations was at the heart of that discussion on the future relationship. And that is all quite abstract. And so Michel Barnier, who's quite visual in a way, said, well, I need a slide to show to the leaders in the December 17 Council. And the slide that is projected now, I think, or that people can see on their screens, was then the slide that we basically put together by saying, well, UK, you decide on your red lines, that's fine, we're not going to contest those, but then there are consequences that you have to accept. So if you don't want the Norwegian-style obligations, you don't get the Norwegian rights in terms of single market participation. If you want to be in a customs union like Turkey, there are constraints on your trade policy. So if you want your independent trade policy, you don't want to be under the jurisdiction of the Court of Justice as far as union law is concerned, you don't want to respect free movement of people, well then you cascade down to where Canada and South Korea are, which is basically what the Johnson government also deliberately chose as its model for the future relationship with the UK, with the EU, sorry. So it's a visualization of something rather abstract and complex, trade models, customs unions, and I think it worked very well to the point that it went viral in a strange way, because I was sometimes at conferences where a workshop leader would pull it out of his or her pocket, a British workshop leader, and would say, well, we have a discussion now on the options for the future, and I have a slide here that to guide our discussions. And I wasn't involved, and that was just a consultant or an expert or an academic who said, well, this is an interesting slide to start that discussion. So in that sense, it was circulating throughout Europe. It's not fancy graphically. It was designed by a few amateurs in our office. There's no graphic designer involved in this. It was just a visualization of a message, which I think in the end worked quite powerful. It worked quite powerful also because as things go in communication, you do not control things. And on the UK side, people who were supportive of this slide says, well, our policy is a policy of what we would call cakeism, or have your cake and eating it. It's something we never said. It's something Michel Barnier never said, because that has an underlying accusation tone in a way. So we never wanted to engage in that kind of emotional attack on the British position. But it was taken up in the UK. And everybody, from the reaction in the room also, you could see everybody recognizes it, or the people who follow the Brexit debate recognized it. So sometimes things happen in communication. So unity, transparency, or repetition. Final point, it would be parsimony and not communicating too often and too much. In the Brexit debate, I think that was important. There were moments when we spoke. There were moments when we as negotiation team were also quiet or relatively quiet, or didn't, in any case, want to make a big splash of communication. Michel Barnier gave key speeches, but they were paced, and they were not every week. They were not every month even. His first public appearance was in December 16, 3 months after having taken office, even though the expectations out there were massive at that point. The referendum was fresh, everybody was wondering, there was anxiety as well, what will happen with this? We kept a low profile because we wanted to prepare first internally before saying anything publicly. And we have kept that up until now, I would think. So it's sometimes better not to say things rather than to say things. And when we said things, it was often a repetition of what we had said already. And sometimes I went also to London to repeat what we had said already, and it seemed to be quite new for the audience, in spite of us having repeated it for 10 months in Brussels and in other capitals. So it's important to know when to shut up, I think, in communication. And in the Brexit debate, I think that became particularly important because sometimes the UK debate also needed time. So when new ideas came out or when the government took a new position, clearly there was a debate within the UK. So there was sometimes an anxiety or a tendency on our side in internal discussions about should we not do something, should we not react? Because this clearly is not something that we will ever be able to accept, for instance, in terms of cherry picking the single market. But even on such occasions, we kept sometimes a low profile because you could feel that the UK debate still needed to unfold over the newest idea that had come up. And I think that's then also an important issue to keep in mind. So unity, transparency, repetition, and parsimony were the 4 principles I wanted to put out there today. Thank you.
Many thanks, Stefan. It was very interesting to hear about the interlinks between political work, about such topic, unique in our European history. And I think for even if this is a particular case, we still can consider in our work when we sell heavy topics these 4 examples of unity or be consistent, to be transparent if this is needed. I would like now to give the floor to Jessica. Jessica Craig is from the Scottish National Health Service. This is our second immunizations and vaccines. Is here, but I think almost everywhere we have in the last years big problem with anti-vax campaigns and situation and to start a new campaign. And we are very curious to hear about your experience, Jessica.
Hi there. So as Svetla said, my name is Jessica Craig and I work for NHS Health Scotland and we're responsible for national communications about immunisation to the Scottish public. So the WHO have stated that the 2 public health interventions that have had the greatest impact on the world's health are clean water and vaccines. And we know that vaccination prevents millions of deaths globally and that vaccines are safe and effective. And yet, in the past few decades, we've seen a surge in anti-vax sentiments. Andrew Wakefield's discredited 1998 article led to distrust in the MMR vaccine that we're still seeing today, which has led to multiple measles outbreaks in countries where measles was considered eliminated. In fact, the UK lost its measles-free status this year. We've seen people of influence put fear and distrust in parents, and of course the rise of social media has led to an increased spread of misinformation. This has led to an increase in vaccine hesitancy, which the WHO listed as one of the top 10 threats to global health in 2019. The reasons why people choose not to vaccinate are very complex, but it's worth trying to understand them. The WHO have suggested there are 3 key reasons relating to complacency, where the perceived risk of the diseases is low, and therefore vaccination seems unnecessary. Confidence in the vaccines themselves, the system, and policymakers, and convenience in actually accessing vaccination. While communication is not necessarily one of the key reasons, when it's poor communication, it can negatively influence uptake and it can contribute to vaccine hesitancy. Talking about vaccination is difficult because, of course, it touches on very strong values like protection of children, social responsibility, and respect for science. I will very briefly highlight some aspects of our approach in Scotland to communicating about vaccination. The first thing we do when we're planning a campaign or developing a resource is try to figure out who we're trying to reach with that message, because that could vary widely from pregnant women to parents to older adults. It's important to consider their specific needs, their attitudes, and their values when developing your communication plan. We often will conduct pre-testing and consultation with that specific public group to identify these needs. A good example would be our 2008 HPV campaign. We did pre-testing with young girls, their parents, education staff, and as a result of that, we were able to deliver a campaign which helped meet the needs and knowledge that the questions they had about the HPV vaccine. And now, years later, Scotland has some of the highest uptake of HPV, with over 90% of girls getting vaccinated. It's also important to understand their main sources of information. So in Scotland, we have a relatively high population of Polish migrants, and recent studies have found significantly lower uptake of certain vaccines in Polish students, such as flu and HPV. We wanted to understand this better, so through focus research groups with Polish parents, we identified obviously a wide range of possible reasons, but we also found out that social media was one of their main sources of information about vaccination. And this contributed to us creating a Twitter account to try to reach Polish parents who might be hesitating or unsure about vaccination. There is a lot of misinformation obviously out there about vaccines, so it's important that the information we share is reliable, it's accurate, and it's evidence-based. We work really closely with experts on immunization in Scotland, and we make sure that we have references to back up the statistics and information we share. As a result, our website has been accredited by the WHO Vaccine Safety Net, and this accreditation means it's a reliable and accurate source of information about vaccination. We focus on sharing key and simple messages, though it's important to say we don't oversimplify our messages. We understand that the public value transparency, as Stefan mentioned, so we make sure to share information about vaccine ingredients, possible side effects, because research we have conducted with the public tells us that this is information they want to know to make an informed choice. It's also important to consider the tools when you're trying to reach your audience, and this will vary obviously based on who you're trying to reach and the messages you're trying to share. When we're talking about a vaccine which already has very good uptake and isn't necessarily controversial, we might focus more on just printed materials. But if we're looking at the introduction of a new vaccine or a vaccine where there's typically been lower uptake, such as flu, we'll often use a wider approach and use TV, radio, social media to try to reach people through a variety of channels. We also evaluate our campaigns in order to inform future campaigns. That was a very brief overview, but hopefully helpful. These are some great references if you are looking for more information on the topic. I know these slides will be shared online later. And thank you very much.
Thank you, Jessica. Once again, what the takeaway from Jessica's presentation: make messages simple, but not simplistic, not over simple. Be very prepared with your audience, with your really work on your focus groups in advance, and choose your tools. I'm sure we will come back with questions, but I would like now to give the floor to Marcin Monku, who works in the European Research Council, and he is dealing with communication around research projects, European research projects, but today he will speak about black holes. I don't know if you remember what you did on the 10th of April, but I remember it was a big event. It was prepared, I think, many weeks in advance in many countries in the world, in Tokyo, Washington. I think Marcin will tell us more. But here in Brussels, it was a big press conference too. And I have to say, in the really very good sense of the word, it was a kind of Hollywood event. You had a teaser, you had an element of secrecy, culmination, drama around the first picture in the history of a black hole. which was, of course, also with participation of European project. And we want to know more how you structured this communication, how you prepare it, how you came to this idea. The floor is yours.
So first of all, we learned and so on, but I had the chance to coordinate this campaign from Brussels, but this project relied on the devotion and professionalism of many colleagues and partners at the European Research Council, Commission, Spokesperson Service, Commissioner Moedar's cabinet, social media team at the European Commission, and the audiovisual service, as well as the you can see here, as well as the communication officers in the research centers across the world, with and first of all, 3 scientists that we funded, Heino Falke, Michael Kramer, and Luciano De Zola, who played key roles in the discovery and had this communication reflex to warn me in advance that something big was coming. And this topic was heavy because, after all, it's a supermassive black hole. A mysterious space object with a huge mass and a very compact size, which creates a gravitational pull so strong that nothing can escape it, including light. So many people thought that actually we will never see a black hole, but they were wrong. And this is the picture that an international group of scientists managed to take. The EU funded a big part of this effort, and we at the European Research Council believed that the EU had to be also the messenger of this important news. So as soon as we learned that scientists have probably succeeded in their observations, we decided on our goal. And it was pretty simple: to claim the ownership of this discovery and to show the EU's prowess in research. How to do it? Our answer was to break the news in Brussels. Not in America, or not only in America, like it happens very often with big science stories, but here, in the biggest media hub in the world, even though an untypical place to make such announcements. So what were our tactics? First of all, it was making funding part of the narrative, part of the story, making sure that all communication material of our partners around the world mention EU contribution. Then leveraging all stakeholders' social media presence and having the best audiovisual content easily available for the media and other users, including the sleekest live broadcast of a press conference. And the result was amazing. I mean, you can see here some examples. We've produced the European Commission's most watched live video, the most engaging tweet ever, same for the Instagram post. More than 1,000 mentions in the press. We had full house at the Berlaymont press room, which probably only Brexit task force can compete with. And we had live broadcasts on BBC News and 90 other TV stations. So you could ask, what was so heavy? But at the beginning, the subject itself seemed to be heavy. Science can be boring, technical, complicated. Is it really worth it? Some people say, this blurry orange donut, I mean, how much did it cost? And so what? What's in it for European citizen? Of course, scientists were all excited, but won't journalists make fun of it? Won't they connect it to Brexit or to the hole in the EU budget? Before the event, this looked like quite a risky bet, and it took some convincing to get everyone on board. However, when colleagues on the day saw that 100,000 people were waiting to watch live the press conference on YouTube, I think we knew that we betted right. So another heavy aspect was the question how to manage a collaboration of dozens of scientists in more than 50 institutes around the world. This was quite a straining process of 4 months of weekly teleconferences, hundreds of phone calls, emails, and it was saved by some patience and key relationships with EU-funded researchers. There was also one thing that many of us really worried about, and it was a leak. The campaign relied on the suspense. There was a real risk that some trigger-happy scientist with an access to this image just blows the whole thing. I've seen the picture early on, but for this reason, I didn't want to have the file with me. Just until a few days before the release. So we did not send it embargo to press, and we really limited the number of people who had access to the image. So that, and then came the big day, and the, I would say, minefield of choreography, because the scientists, I think, seem to want to have a sort of symposium with a series of lectures with overhead projector. On the other hand, I think political communicators wanted to have a short press point with a commissioner in focus. And to find a common ground, I mean, it required a lot of kind of shuttle diplomacy. Pushing the limits on both sides and negotiations, but also educating both scientists of political realities and political communicators of how actually scientists and science work. So yeah, and then we also had help from some external consultants to have a kind of outside view on this. In the end, I think we had a very nice online event that was watchable, and 3 million people until now watched it on YouTube. And when we thought that all the loose ends are tied up, we got a surprise, extraordinary EU summit on Brexit, same day, 10th of April. So on top of the normal problems with getting accreditations, access to secure to Berlaymont building, which is a high security place, we had a security perimeter and possibly a huge news just on the other side of the road, which would suck all the media attention from our press conference. So, I mean, how did we solve it? Well, we didn't. We were just lucky that the heads of governments and members of the European Council met 2 hours later, and so the scientists could cover both events on the same day. So a little bit of luck. So we learned many things about working in partnerships, creating suspense, preparing and rehearsing. But for me, one lesson stands out, and this is: don't underestimate people's ability to be inspired. And for many of us, skeptics and a little cynical sometimes, this indeed looked like a costly, blurry donut. But once we revealed it and explained it, people started to talk about a scientific breakthrough, the one-way door from our universe, the gates of hell, the ring of fire, the ultimate end of space and time, about seeing the unseeable. So we are told, and we often tell ourselves, that we must always communicate on benefits, on concrete stuff like mobile roaming fees or Erasmus stipends. But at the same time, we should not underestimate curiosity-driven science's power to inspire. And with the inspiration, I think, comes common feeling, rapport, and hopefully a more favorable view of the EU and what it does for citizens. Thank you.
Many thanks, Marcin. My takeaway will be, if we need it, we are sometimes too institutions. We always think, oh, what the press will say after. But maybe sometimes when we try to put the things in context, I will not keep you any longer from questions. I will open up the questions and answer session. Please use the microphone and tell us also who you are. Yes.
Hi, I am Letizia. I work for the Council of the European Union. I wanted to ask all the speakers actually how important it is to know the news beforehand. I mean, in the case of the black hole, the coordination was long. In the case of Brexit, you explained how you got time to prepare yourself. I think in the case of vaccination, you explained also how long the preparation is. But sometimes things happen like on the moment. And what is the trade-off that we have to take to be able to communicate well? I mean, I think as communicators, we always want long planning and very, heavy planning. But on the other hand, how can we learn from this experiences on how to also react, or maybe how to act in advance to things, so to propose.
Thank you. I will take some more. Yes, please.
Hello, my name is Maria Agnes Heine. I'm the head of communications at the European Medicines Agency. And I was interested in asking Jessica about her vaccine information portal there. Currently, we are working together with the ECDC to create a European vaccine information portal, and would be then happy to actually benefit already from your experience. But what you didn't mention in your presentation was how you evaluated already, the results of this new information, whether you already have any results and whether you can share those with us. Thank you.
Okay, one more. No more questions. Okay, then I will give the floor to the speakers, and we will have again a second tour, of course, of questions. Maybe I will start with Marcin for the preparation of a new event.
So indeed, we were blessed with a long time to prepare. This doesn't happen always. Sometimes we are just taken by surprise. The day before, a scientist tells us that we have a big paper in Science tomorrow. So, but my advice would be to basically keep your eyes and ears open. I mean, in our case, we have almost 10,000. So at ERC, 10,000 projects. So it's very difficult to monitor and know in advance where the breakthrough, where the discovery will come. But I think what you can always do is to establish some key trust relationships with the institutions and people. So we work with universities, with research centers, with press officers in these places, and we try to kind of to sustain these relationships in order to get the information about the story well in advance. Because this is key. This whole campaign on the black hole image wouldn't work if we had less time.
Stefan, you sometimes maybe don't have time to prepare.
For sure, sometimes there is not much time and there is something happening that you need to react quickly to. But I think, again, we need to bring it back to the fact that in the Brexit context, all along, we had a rather a stable mandate from the very start of negotiations, where the EU27 had made very clear what its principles were and how it saw first the withdrawal and then how it saw the nature of the future relationship. So if there then were indeed surprise elements or statements that felt like we needed a reaction to, you didn't need to start from scratch in terms of messaging, because we knew always in which context you were embedded and what our key messages were. That comes back to what I said at the beginning, the repetition of core messages. Then, of course, we're not in a campaign communication mode or other things. We're just in a political communication, where I think over time and through our actions, Michel Barnier became, and the Commission became like a trusted EU source, authoritative source on what the EU would think about certain Brexit challenges that maybe popped up and needed an immediate reaction. Because also of that EU unity. And then what you then can do is actually very simple. We have used Twitter in a quite powerful way. There were moments where we used Twitter before the UK was going to say something about something, but we already knew what was coming, more or less. Or there were moments where we used Twitter to react immediately to a government declaration, a government position. And even that 280 characters, or when we started 140 characters, it was often quite powerful. We didn't have to do threads or anything. We just managed to condense what we had to say in 140 or 280 characters. And again, you're in political communication, so when Michel Barnier goes somewhere, there's often a camera which spots him, and then there's also occasions to, of course, react on the spot to different issues. And we can also do, I'm not sure how, that was not very frequent, we can do impromptu kind of press statements, interviews, and so on. So it's quite political in that sense, and it's so quite easy and flexible and agile to plan. You don't have a multi-stakeholder coordination platform or 50 people who need to be coordinated because you're part of a campaign. That's not the kind of situation we were ever in.
And Jessica, maybe on the evaluation and possible cooperation?
Absolutely. So we do conduct evaluations quite often on the campaigns that we do. I suppose specifically maybe what would be relevant to yourself would be the focus groups that we've done with Polish parents. As a result of this research, we realized that while we translate our materials into all the other languages, including Polish, it's a direct translation from English and therefore doesn't necessarily meet the specific needs of those groups. So we realized that these parents coming from Poland, in Poland vaccination is very different. There's mandatory vaccines, there's recommended vaccines, and therefore flu vaccine, which is recommended in Poland, isn't really seen as important. And that is part of the reason why the uptake was so low in Polish students in Scotland. So we created a specific leaflet for Polish students as a pilot I tried to address some of the specific questions those parents had, and we did evaluate that, and that is going into a paper that's being submitted as well, along with wider results from the focus groups with them. I'd be happy to share with yourself once it's published. And just in general, I suppose with our larger campaigns like flu and HPV, we conduct an annual evaluation with an external research and marketing group, because it's important to find out what worked and what didn't work, and not repeat the same mistakes, obviously, in future years. So hopefully that helps.
Any other questions? Yes, please.
Yeah, Gareth Harding from Clear Europe. Just wondering if you think there are any topics which you think are too difficult to communicate, just too complex, or ones you've particularly struggled with, like, I don't know, Britain's or Labour's position on Brexit, or the backstop, or some extremely complex scientific theory which you struggled with?
It was also on the back, one question.
Yeah, I would like to know more about the mix between information and emotion, because maybe also especially on the vaccination campaigns, in my experience, people are less receptive to facts and information and are very much guided by emotions and feelings. So how do you deal with this topic, and yeah, have you found a solution to that?
Any other questions for the moment? Yes, please.
Okay, thanks. My name is Anne-Mette Jensen. I'm with the Commission's Joint Research Centre. My question goes to Martin Manco, because you mentioned a communication instinct, I think you called it, that you had been fortunate that these scientists had, let's say, had the foresight to contact you well in advance. And I was just wondering, you know, as communication colleagues here, we often work with people who are not trained in that field, and whether you're doing anything in particular to, let's say, nurture that instinct or to raise awareness in a consistent way, or are you relying a little bit on chance to get these scoops, which, and if it's the latter, of course, there is the risk that you are actually also losing some of these opportunities. Thank you.
Okay, we will take one more. Not, yeah?
I just wanted to address a little bit bringing good news, especially when you're selling a heavy topic. So I think the black hole story is quite interesting, because so often the media, they want to take negative news and make it really sensational. And I'm in a sector where negative news gets a lot of pickup by the press, but trying to bring good stories is quite difficult. So maybe a few more details on bringing technical but good news stories to the media and getting them on board in that sense.
Thank you. Maybe Stefan with the first question.
Yes, thank you. Well, your question was, the first question was basically, are there issues that are too difficult or too complex to communicate, or too heavy, I guess? And you made reference to wanting labor and backstop, and on both. Well, maybe on labor first, just a general comment. I mean, labor is in the opposition since the referendum has happened. We met Labour people on several occasions. Michel Barnier met Jeremy Corbyn on several occasions. But we never had to take any position on what Labour was thinking. I mean, it's the opposition. We negotiate with the government. And so our focus was solely on what is the government thinking, what is the government's negotiation objectives, and how do we position ourselves in that context. So, and in a way, that's part of the answer to your question on the backstop as well. I understand that, you know, the backstop is something technically difficult, and the backstop that is no longer part of the final withdrawal agreement now with the Johnson government, by the way, just to avoid any ambiguity here. So we moved to a permanent solution subject to the democratic consent of the Northern Irish elected representatives. But when we had the whole backstop discussion, that then terminated in March 19 with instruments of interpretation and joint instruments. A few points on that. Of course, this was very controversial in the UK context, because essentially what this was about was a trade-off. The commitment from the UK, which we could work with and which was very, very positive, was to keep the border open, basically, so to avoid a hard border between Northern Ireland and Ireland. But that then resulted in having to make choices in terms of how two sovereign jurisdictions, EU and UK, would interact, and how checks and friction at the border would be managed, and all the rest of it. And so my key point to that would be, yes, that was very controversial in the UK, but our communication was to the 27, first of all. I think that's something that is often misunderstood in the Brexit context. We are negotiating on behalf of the 27, and our communication is, of course, picked up heavily in the UK. But by and large, our focus is the 27. And the remarkable issue that you could point to is that in the 27 side, the solidarity with Ireland has been tremendously strong, and the unity with the support for the backstop at the time and the support for the new solution today has been tremendously strong. And so, again, you say, is this too complex to communicate? Well, not in the context of communicating to the Irish media, to Irish public opinion, and to the EU 27 as a whole. The controversy again was rather on the UK side, and then that's something primarily for UK political system to deal with. Of course, you'd say, well, it's also, of course, in your interest to inform the public opinion, the media in the country you're negotiating with. And that, of course, is something that we have done through Michel Barnier's speeches and to others to say, well, look, if you leave the single market, you leave the customs union, there is no such thing as frictionless trade, so you will have to make up your mind on how it's going to work, since we all both agree to keep the Irish border open. So it comes back to also what I said in the introduction, I guess, is this is a complex issue from the regulatory technical side, from the customs side, from regulatory compliance and standards and all the rest of it. But I think if you boil it down to, well, you made choices to leave the single market, the customs union, there are consequences to that, and we need to find a new solution. You kind of explain things in general terms which people can understand. On the question of emotion, I think keeping calm is also an emotion, so I think we shouldn't underestimate the emotional nature of the side on the EU 27, but clearly again, selling heavy topics, controversy on the UK side, Brexit is an incredibly emotional debate because it's an identity question for people, no matter which side you stand on, Remain side or Brexit side. And it has become even more that kind of issue if you look at opinion research in the UK, that it has become part of people's political identity where they stand on Brexit. But that's just a given for the party we are negotiating with. That's not something that we are primarily communicating with.
Maybe Jessica emotion and misinformation maybe too in the topic.
Absolutely. So we have found that providing only scientific explanations of why you should vaccinate rather than delving into the emotions is highly ineffective. It's important to also talk about the emotional reasons why we vaccinate. This is part of the reason why a lot of anti-vax comments can be quite effective, because they will often play into the emotions of people who have been impacted by events in their lives, and they provide them with misleading causal explanations for this. For instance, claiming that MMR vaccine causes autism. Typically, autism will be diagnosed around the time when children are getting vaccines, and parents might be looking for an explanation and are understandably perhaps upset about this, and they will sometimes latch on to an explanation that is handed to them by anti-vax comments. So we try to take this from our perspective by delving into the emotions of what can happen if these diseases that vaccines prevent against aren't vaccinated against. And we have videos and anecdotes from parents who didn't vaccinate their children against certain, say, MMR or the meningitis vaccines, and as a result their child had meningitis or experienced difficult events in their lives because of these diseases that they got, which are preventable by vaccines. And I think these are important stories to share, and having the people who've experienced it themselves sharing it through videos is a really effective way of trying to reach out through emotion. I suppose just in terms of misinformation in general, in terms of, I guess, dealing with anti-vax comments and whatnot on social media, which is such a big issue nowadays, we tend to go by the logic of don't go there. If it's a strong, adamant anti-vaxxer, they typically are not wanting to engage in a scientific debate, and they won't necessarily respond to evidence that you provide to them. On the other hand, addressing their comments can be beneficial in diminishing them and obviously providing information for hesitant onlookers who might be watching. So we will evaluate it on a case-by-case basis. If the person who comments is influential, or if the post leads to a wide variety of comments that starts to get attention, then we will respond, but we keep it factual, polite, and brief, and we don't tend to engage in debates.
Martin?
So about the complex complex stories, complex topics. I think first of all, I mean, you can pick your battles. You know, so sometimes, you know, and there are very complex. In our case, very complex projects that we fund, and maybe not the best to show how science works. On the other hand, I will just read you. We communicated on a paper in Nature, and the title of this paper was "Chondritic Xenon in the Earth's Mantle." Okay. And actually, this was one of the most, one of our most successful media relations campaigns. A small one, very targeted, because it turns out that the scientists, the EU-funded scientists who discovered this xenon, which is a noble gas, discovered it in a water well, not far from here in Eifel, in a place where people go for walks. A nice park, hilly, and people somehow, you know, knew something about xenon, because, you know, xenon is like, as people who drive cars, you know, they know that there's some xenon lights, so this kind of ring the bell, and it was quite a nice story, a local story in Rheinpfalz, Rheinpfalz in the German federal state in Luxembourg, and we got a little bit of exposure, media exposure in Belgium. So even in such a very complex technical story, I mean, you can find some elements, some aspects that will just resonate with people and with journalists as well. And should I answer also the?
Yes, please.
Yeah. So yes, that's. I mean, for us, it's a challenge. Yeah. I mean, with those three scientists that had this key role in black hole discovery, black hole image discovery. Yeah, they had this reflex, yeah, sort of naturally, you know. But since last year, we've decided to contact all our new grantees and encourage them to communicate on the award, first of all, which we hope that will also sort of spill over into, you know, the results of this funding. And so communication about the results, and that they will let us know in advance. I think sometimes it works, sometimes it doesn't, but that's one thing that we do. This year, the ERC also started to train new grantees, of course, on a sort of we can't train all, so first case on the basis of, you know, first come first served. Last month we trained I think around 30 new scientists, but yes, we have 1,000 every year new grants. And then the last but not the least, next year we will be awarding a special communication prize at one of the biggest science conferences called ESOF in Trieste. So we are encouraging also scientists that we fund to submit their application for this award. And of course, that I think that shows that ERC cares about communication, about what our grantees do to reach out to the public.
Any further questions? Yes, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Good morning, citizens. My name is Angelos Harlaftis, Epafos Advisors. We represent the ECOEFS movement, a pan-European and Mediterranean movement which is based in direct democracy, in science and in ecology. We are searching for communication guys or journalists who they follow the science of journalism. And I didn't want to speak as the gentleman spoke, but we hear here things of the system, of the current system, of the elites, which is speaking about the vaccines. The vaccines, of course, I'm a scientist and I'm working in the health sector between the others, in a deeper level, are a big question. The question from our side, it comes and says, okay, if there is a population who are denying the vaccines, and also there are a lot of scientists who they are living in the dark side of the moon because they don't follow the systemic approach, why the journalists, they don't research in a deeper level why this anti-vaccine movement exists? Because the system says that in a lot of countries it must be obligatory, in some cases, a lot of vaccines. The vaccines are good for the health, generally speaking, but obliging the population or guiding the population to be vaccinated like the cows or other animals, it's, I think, against democratic elements, putting in front the scientific side, which is not exactly in some sides. For example, we have a lot of vaccines.
May I ask you just if you have a question to Jessica, maybe concrete?
I know that I'm a little bit, the question is, the statement is a question also. I know that you don't agree with this, but it's a case in democracy you have to examine and discuss. Thank you very much.
Okay, we will hear also what Jessica will say. It's a controversial topic, we know, and we have it also here. Other questions? Yes, thank you. Yes? Yes, please. The lady behind, yeah?
Oh, okay, good. Laura Serasio from European Committee of the Regions Press Unit. I have a question for Stefan on communicating prior to Brexit. We know the EU decided not to do so. We know the rationale not to interfere into a purely national internal debate. Brexit is not the only field where this happened. It's an assumption that we know also for other fields. Don't you think in such a peculiar field such as Brexit, it would have been useful, feasible at all to communicate prior to Brexit, maybe informing, not necessarily, informing doesn't necessarily mean interfering, but being more present prior to the referendum? Thanks.
Any further questions?
It's more of a comment, though, or an answer to a previous question about the mix. Sorry, I didn't introduce myself. Tina Zrnetzi. I'm in DG Communication, managing the strategic communication campaigns that the Commission is doing towards citizens. And I wanted to come back to the issue of emotions and the question about, how to use emotions. What we have found out in our campaigns, which are targeting average citizens, if that thing exists, but targeted always at different groups of citizens, is that you need emotions to break through, especially for institutional communicators like us. You need to do something different, to reach out to people who will never come and read our press releases or follow our Twitter accounts or even like us on Facebook. You need to use emotions to break through all that noise and to get people interested. But what we can't do is just rely on that, and because that tends to become manipulation, and that's the last thing we would want to do in our communication. Is you need to back the emotional communication or the emotional stories that are based on real stories, people's stories. You need to back it up with facts and figures, so that at the end, once you have made that connection with citizens, that you have the concrete facts that this is not just a one in a an example, but it's symbolic of something bigger that we're doing. And this is very hard to do. Sometimes those stories become in themselves, you know, people focus on the story rather on the bigger message, and that's also our responsibility to kind of zoom out and show that this is just an example of something bigger. But also, people are not used to seeing emotional communication from institutions, so it's a bit, you know, a bit of a surprise, and then makes them a bit also skeptical and say, why are they doing this? Are they trying to manipulate me? So it's very difficult for us to go there. We have been doing it, and I think we've been doing it successfully to a certain extent. We're still learning from our examples. We have a very nice video that the EU Protects campaign has on vaccinations, where we actually do exactly what you said. We let the people talk, we let mothers talk, a mother who has lost a child, a mother who is thinking about vaccinating or not because of disinformation, and then in the end we have the scientists who show the data, we have the doctor, and we tell a story of, you know, when somebody doubts what to do about their child, where to seek the advice, and how this is representative of a much bigger work that we do both at European and national level. So it's a challenge. If there's other ideas of how to use both, I think this is the place to discuss this. Thank you.
Okay, I will take one more.
Hello everyone, my name is Emilia. I used to work for DG Connect for 6 years in the communications field, and now I'm at the European Asylum Support Office, so we are also selling a heavy topic, let's say. But in relation to what you just said, because I participated in the disinformation panel, and there they were talking about emotions, and that if an article makes you feel angry, you need to really double check the content. So I really think I will disagree with what you just said. It's not about emotions anymore, and that we are, let's say, trying to tell stories or to reach out to people, because I think there is a general misunderstanding when we speak about vaccination. For example, is that what vaccines are relevant and what are not that relevant, maybe explaining it in very simple terms. And I think the biggest power of the institutions are actually the human resource, and that we need to reach out to our staff and maybe make them be more active on social media, and them as experts explaining how things work from the inside of the institutions. And I'm saying this also because I'm doing internal communications now at the agency, and I know that this is becoming a thing, this is becoming more and more relevant for the EU institutions, and this can only make me glad and pleased.
And I'm very glad that we have already 30 minutes after starting with questions and answers in this session on controversial topics. We have already controversial debates in the room. I would summarize maybe the question, are we allowed to use emotion storytelling, or to which extent we are allowed as European communicators to use them? And maybe Jessica then, especially on vaccination. Let's start with Stefan.
Thank you. So on the question on should we have done more prior to the referendum, basically. I think we have to distinguish two periods, which is the period prior to the Cameron settlement or the deal, that was early 16, and then we have, of course, the 6 months, more or less shorter, 5 months, I think it was, between that deal and the actual referendum. Of course, prior to 16, we dealt with the UK, like the way Commission and DG Communication and the spokespersons and the College of Commissioners deals with any other member state. So we had campaigns on more to the emotional side, you know, the stronger together, the 50 or 60 years of the treaties and all those issues. So the big communication campaigns, as well as explaining the policies. Our colleagues in London tried to do quite a lot on myth busting. Stories like, you know, the EU was going to ban crisps with a prawn flavor, to just name one, quite famous. You know, to demystify or to actually to do myth busting and to rebut such kind of stories, with a special section on their website to explain, you know, what was true and what was not true about stories that appeared in the British media. So in that period, though, I think it's also very important to note that a lot of people who ended up on the British side advocating for Remain were, prior to 2016, advocating that it was not a big deal to leave the EU as well. And so that then turns, of course, to the analysis of what happened in Britain, but a number of people also with government responsibility were on that line, which then brings you the whole debate, well, can the EU institutions be strong enough to resist the national public debate when the national public debate is on terms that we don't like or we think is not correct or we think should be corrected? And that's a hard one. But I think what we certainly could do more, and that's a bit to Tina's question already, is to, beyond the emotional element and appealing to emotions, is to make sure the communication is more personal as well, and that people, civil servants, I think, also would have a duty there to come more out of the, you know, the anonymity or the out of hiding in a way, and just be transparent and just explain as human beings, what Martin said earlier, what we do basically, and what we work on and why. As far as then the decision that was taken not to get involved as institutions in the referendum, that was a deliberate decision that President Juncker has regretted in the meantime. He has said, well, David Cameron asked me not to get involved, and I did that, and looking back at that now, I think it was a mistake. Whether it then, our involvement would have changed or swayed, the vote is of course a totally different matter. But anyway, I think that is something that President Juncker has regretted, and he's on the record for saying that. If you look though at the campaign, here I'm from the communication hat more than from where my preference would be, the Take Back Control slogan was quite a good one, I think, from the Leave campaign, compared to we are stronger in, or because that's just, stronger in is just a statement of fact, in my view, and in the view of the people who work for the EU. Take Back Control is an actionable slogan. And when you have an actionable slogan, you speak more to people, obviously. You as an individual, you can actually do something rather than agree with something. And I think that is quite powerful, so maybe we can learn something also from how the Leave campaign organized that. The Leave campaign had it, of course, a bit easier because there were two campaigns rather than one on the Remain side, so they had a bit more freedom of messaging, if I can put it like that. So, but to come back, yeah, President Juncker has regretted it, and I think more generally, I think we need to think about personalized communication where civil servants like us come more out of the anonymity and speak basically and show what they are doing.
Martin?
About the emotions, I think I'm not going to say much new. I mean, I think you need emotions to draw attention, to keep this attention. And today it's a very difficult task. But I think, as Tina said, I think you need emotions, and you need facts, you need evidence, and I think, you know, we are not. You don't get into, you know, kicking contest with a horse, and I'm afraid our competitive advantage is in the facts, in policy evidence, and not necessarily in being only emotional. So you need to have this this buffer of facts, and you need to, because I think in the end today, I think many surveys show that, you know, people are worried about misinformation. They're looking for trustful sources of facts, and perhaps this is where we are strong.
Jessica.
So I suppose there are a few points to try to touch on. First, I'll say in the UK, vaccination is not obligatory. We very much value informed choice, and our view is that in order to do so, the public need to be presented with accurate information because there is a lot of misinformation and disinformation being spread. So just to say that our role, we feel like, is providing that information so the public can make an informed choice. In terms of emotion, I completely agree that it's absolutely important to not just present emotion, but to also present scientific evidence. That is, of course, where we come from, being, I suppose, the voice of the NHS in Scotland. So we work with experts on immunisation, we work with epidemiologists, we supply the data to back up what we are sharing. And when we are sharing emotional videos, we don't just focus on, I suppose, sad videos or videos that could invoke fear, but we also try to normalize vaccination. We have parents talking about why they're vaccinating their children just from their perspective, or we will sometimes have healthcare workers because we know that they're an important source of information for the public. So we'll try to do videos of them explaining from their point of view as a doctor or a nurse why vaccination continues to be important. And I suppose that touches on your point of having these advocates, because we are very much aware that people go to see healthcare workers to get their vaccines, and if you're seeing someone who themselves seems a bit hesitant about it, it doesn't put a lot of trust in you. So we do a lot of work with ensuring that healthcare workers in Scotland feel comfortable and confident talking about vaccines. We do modules and training, and if there are hesitant healthcare workers, we try to identify why they're having these thoughts and feelings, and I suppose it's about reaching out to them as well. So.
Thank you. I have here one question.
Yes, it's going back to the Brexit and the preparatory area. You mentioned the slogan, "Take back control." However, going back even further, like pre-vote and when things were all being prepared, do you think that things would have gone differently if it had been branded Bremain as opposed to Brexit, like just at that level of the campaign?
And one more.
A couple of points. Just wanted to, Richard Addy from ACAS, I was on a panel on impact yesterday. Just want to reiterate Stefan's point around Brexit. For decades, we had the leadership of the Conservative Party knocking Europe, and so it wasn't credible that in the last 3 months they were suddenly trying to campaign for Remain. Your point about repetition, people had heard the same message from Cameron and others about how bad Europe was, so they weren't going to listen to him when he said he wanted to Remain. The more substantive point, though, is about emotion. I think the debate about emotion needs to move on, because the behavioral science shows that you need both rationality and emotion, but emotion leads to 95% of people's decision-making intuitively without even knowing. So surely the question should be more about not should we talk about emotions, but which emotions should we try to evoke?
More questions? Yes, please.
I just thought about the relation between emotion and rational approach. My name is Mark. I work in an advertising agency, and for branding, before a strategy, we never ask if it must be emotional or rational. This is just a tone of voice. We start from the strategy, from the message we want to do, from the insight we want to communicate, and finding the right insight after we decide if it must be more rational, more emotional, but we never start from this question for building a strategy.
Okay, thank you. Any other questions? Yes, on the back.
My name is Brendan Burns. I'm a member of the European Economic Committee. I'm a member of this House. There is something, it's not really a question, it's a statement concerning Brexit. Brexit was not an 8-week programme. It was 30 years of drip, drip, drip lies and deceit. And the European Union did sod all about trying to countermand the lies that we're being told. And this is what will happen in the rest of Europe. And in case you do wonder why Scotland didn't vote for it, is there's a different press in Scotland and in Northern Ireland. Northern Ireland's is in Belfast, Scotland's are in Glasgow and Edinburgh. The problem was the London-based press. I exempt the Financial Times for that. But the drip, drip, drip constant is something that we have to learn about the rest of Europe as from today. The lies have got to be challenged. You may have all the facts, but if you don't tell the people what the facts are, it's pointless waiting until the point of an election. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. I have one more here.
It's Konstantinos, I'm a researcher in geography. It's not so much a question as a suggestion to the issue of scientific communication. We do know, that xenon is in the periodic table and, is assumed knowledge from school, but so is the carbon cycle or the nitrogen cycle. So I was wondering if it would be a good idea, given the massive amount of interest among the European public on the condition of the climate, to have such, let's say, regular reporting on what's the condition of atmospheric carbon or, our impact on the environment, in key indicators that we have the excellent science in Europe to produce or support, and certainly the EU is co-funding such efforts. So I would want your opinion on this. For instance, Italy recently admitted in the school education system climate change. So why not have a high-profile press conference like that on black holes to reflect on key facts about how carbon works in our ecosystems or in the world. So thanks very much.
Okay, I think we have time for last question, and then I will give the floor to the speakers for closing remarks and answering. Is there any? Okay, then I will start with Stefan, and please have mercy with him. He agreed to speak about communication issues around Brexit. I hope you will understand if he doesn't want to involve himself on political topics now. But I will leave it for him.
No, thanks to good questions. And there are two more points I wanted to make on Brexit. Questions were made on emotions and stuff. And what we have always tried to avoid, and I think succeeded in avoiding, was any sign of aggression or revengeful attitude on the side of the EU. Just a simple regret and let's move on and negotiate that. I think that's different for other communication challenges of the EU. I don't think we can redo the campaign and what slogan and what words should be used. But I think that beyond fighting misrepresentations and fake news and those kind of matters, I think it's important to note that the next Commission, and building also on what the Juncker Commission has done, has a number of important policy priorities which would speak to, and hopefully succeed also in speaking to, people who wouldn't feel left out from the current economic settlement and who have perhaps voted Brexit because of that, because of the lack of public services in their area, or because of the feeling that the economy doesn't work for them. And one of the 6 priorities of the incoming president is to work on an economy that works for all and to have a number of social measures in the first 100 days of her office, of the new college. So it's not just a communication thing, I would say, in terms of what we're looking at. There's also fundamental policy challenges that underlie why some people have indeed voted to leave the European Union. And we need to think about that going forward in terms of the rest of the EU.
Thank you, Martin and Jessica. There were some questions around other scientific topics, around science evidence. Maybe we can think a little bit of the question closing this session about the information and the importance of evidence in all these discussions, and the importance of the role of scientists in these discussions.
Yeah, I think people talk about the post-truth society, and but I think people. I don't like this concept because I think it's people care about truth, really. I mean, people may be sometimes confused because the politics is so polarized, the media is so weak, so it cannot play its traditional role of verifiers of information. And yes, people often confuse the easiness of information access with knowledge. They think they will, do their own research on vaccinations. And so, but yes, I think like one of our own ERC grantees, Nobel Prize winning chemist Ben Feringa said, you can't cure cancer with opinion. You need facts. You need evidence. And I think when in this kind of where performance in areas where, let's say, performance is difficult to measure, like in politics, for example, then opinions matter a lot. But I think people understand that, we need evidence, we need facts to just make decisions, and I think we have the context, we have the debate, the context is sort of conducive for us to bring this evidence, bring these facts, maybe put them into a more digestible, emotional, humorous sometimes packaging, but we have a lot of well, yeah, I mean, we have a lot of capital, in information, in fact. So I'm not worried.
Just to say, I suppose that I think part of understanding the importance of science and communicating science in all of this is education about how to actually evaluate sources of information for being accurate or inaccurate. And I think not everyone necessarily knows how to do that, and that's an important skill to learn. And we certainly value teaching that at a young age to students and children so they can grow up to be able to do that. So, for instance, this year we're piloting a resource in schools in Scotland, and one of the big lessons and units in that program is how do you evaluate online sources of information? How do you know whether a study with 2 participants is actually reliable or not, or a website that you go to for information is actually a reliable source of information with evidence-based information. So I suppose that's just one aspect of, we recognize, I think, that science is very important. We've already touched on emotion, and maybe just a final point is, someone mentioned earlier, media focusing on the positive, not just the negative, and that can happen a lot with vaccination. But a good news story that was big in Scotland this year focused on science and research that was conducted about the HPV vaccine, which has been in Scotland for the last 10 years, and they found a significant reduction in pre-cervical disease. And obviously, being able to have that spread through the media was excellent, and that was all thanks to science. So.
Many thanks. I only have 1 minute to say thank you to our great speakers. Applause. In 10 minutes, here will be the closing session in this room of EuropeCom, so be there. Thank you for your attention.